Good morning. This morning we're going to talk about this idea of why church. This is a question that gets asked in all kinds of different arenas, right? So oftentimes people outside of the Christian faith ask why in the world anyone would get up on a Sunday morning and do this and gather in this way. It can also be asked in circles of our own, in busy schedules and busy parenting phases and taking care of elderly parent phases and taking care of young children and sports schedules and crying kids and all of these things where we ask ourselves, why church? And if you ask a bunch of different people, even inside of a church building, you're likely to get quite a few different answers as to why church. So I wanted to kind of look at it this morning and see. In Psalm 133, it talks about how beautiful it is when the people of God get together. How beautiful it is. It goes into all kinds of imagery that is a bit lost on us in this day and time, but painting as beautiful of a picture as he could about how wonderful it is when Christian people get together. That's not always the case. It doesn't feel like, I know. And sometimes it becomes easier for people to focus on and talk about the reasons why to not go to church than it is to talk about why we do go to church. Let me share this with you. This was a friend of mine. I've seen this before, but a friend of mine just put it up a few days ago, and it fit well with this. He said, 12 reasons why I, as a preacher, have decided to never again attend a UT football game. I come up with a lot more than 12, but 12 reasons why I, as a preacher, have decided to quit attending UT football games. First off, after all these coaches we've had these last several years, not one time did any coach come to visit me at home or in the hospital. Every single time I went to a game, they asked for money. The people sitting in my row didn't seem very friendly at all. They didn't even introduce themselves. The seats were very hard and uncomfortable. The referees made decisions that I did not agree with. I was sitting with a bunch of hypocrites, to be honest. I swear half of them only came to see what everyone else was wearing. Some games went into overtime, and then I was late getting home or missed lunch. The band played some songs I had never heard before. What is up with that? The games are scheduled on my only day to sleep in and run errands. And honestly, my parents just took me to too many games when I was growing up. Since I read a book on sports, I feel that I know more than the coaches anyway. And yeah, less laughter on that one, huh? I don't want to take my children because I want them to get to choose for themselves if they like UT or not. These are all things that we have heard. They're all things that we have said, and we do understand much better inside than outside of the church that the saying is true. A church is not a museum for saints. It is a hospital for sinners. And that's what it should be. Everyone in here, we are all broken sinners who bring our own baggage and our own issues and our own problems and our own things that came from our parents and grandparents and everything else, and then we throw us into a building and we make family, which sounds a lot like family. But we are remiss to act like that everything is all great and wonderful all the time, just as we're remiss if we act like that things are awful and terrible and hypocritical all the time. I do understand that churches can sometimes hurt and harm people. I grew up When I was in high school, I went to a church that split when I was in high school, and I still have friends to this day who were at that church who have never attended church again because they say they were so hurt by this event that happened. I understand that inside church buildings, I know this is shocking, but I understand that people can say some very unkind things about people inside of church buildings, right? But these are issues that we look at and we can focus on about why not to go, why it's easier to not go, but why do we? Why do we show up? Let's look at, we're gonna flip through a few today. We're gonna be talking about this today and next Sunday. Two different angles on why we do this whole church thing in the first place. Let's start in, go to 1 John. 1 John. We're talking about that things can be difficult inside of a church, because if we could really truly believe the verbiage that we use about church being family, then a lot of this would make a lot more sense, right? Because we know in our own families, be it your immediate family, be it a blended family, be it adopted family, whatever it is, we understand that in family there are issues all the time. There are people who don't agree on things all the time. We have families where some people go, to one church and some people go to a different church in our families, our blood families, relative families. We understand that, crazy Aunt so-and-so or wild Uncle so-and-so is always going to have something sideways to say, right? And we still get together anyway. If we could really believe that that's what church is, that church is actually family, then a lot of the issues that we have would make a lot more sense. But even with these issues that we have in every church building around the world, we have things like 1 John chapter 4, verses 20 and 21. 1 John chapter 4, starting in verse 20, it says, "If anyone says, 'I love God,' and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot possibly love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him: whoever loves God must love his brother." Must love his brother. We see this over and over again. And honestly, a lot of times throughout the New Testament, when Paul specifically is talking to churches that Paul has planted or that someone has planted, Paul talks about how bearing with one another in love. Paul talks about how to deal with conflict, how to handle situations. And honestly, what we all have to understand is that those things that Paul is talking about that are so important only pertain if you are meeting together. They only pertain if we are meeting together. Christianity was never, ever, ever, Judaism was never, ever, ever set up as a solitary religion. At no place in time. Adam and Eve, when you read this story of creation, what was the problem when God created Adam? That he was alone. We are never meant to be solitary, ever. God chose a group of people, and God created people as a family. And if you read anything in the Old Testament, from the beginning of God's chosen people all the way through, you see that our family issues have not changed 1 ounce since the very beginning until now. If you read Malachi and read it in a translation that's newer language, you read that in the ESV, NIV, or the Message or something, you would not be able to decipher Malachi's gripes about the temple and the synagogue from our gripes about church today. All of Malachi is about the same issues that we face today. The issues haven't changed. And yet, God has never set this in place as a solitary movement. We are not called to be isolated monks who sit away and learn and study and meditate in isolation. We are called to be together, and that's why so much of the Old Testament and the New Testament focus on relationship and relationship reconciliation. Let's look at Acts. We love Acts. We love Acts chapter 2 especially. Go to Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, verse 42. It says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. This is talking about, this is right after Pentecost, right? Peter preaches this huge sermon, and it's really kind of bizarre. He delivers this huge message, this huge sermon about who Jesus was, and then he just kind of stops and he steps back. And that's it. There's no just as I am saying, there's no altar call, he just kind of steps back. But the natural reaction from everyone is, okay, so what do we do? Like, you've given us all this information, now what do we do with it? And right after this, Peter explains to them Christ. Peter explains to them baptism. Peter explains these things, and it says they devoted themselves to the fellowship. They devoted themselves to the fellowship. And it goes on to describe what that is: taking care of one another, bearing with one another, selling their possessions and giving to those in need as they need. But they devoted themselves to the fellowship. We're going to look at Hebrews, just because Hebrews, we're going to look at one passage in Hebrews today and another one next week. But Hebrews chapter 10 is one that anytime any preacher anywhere talks about the fellowship, the joining together, the coming together of church people in church buildings, Hebrews 10 is always talked about, and we'll address that just briefly here. But in Hebrews 10, if you start in verse 23, it says this. It says, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. He's saying, look, let's put our money where our mouth is. Let's hold fast to what we say. Let's act on what we say we believe. Let's act this thing out. And in that, this is how he says you do that. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. We know this passage in Hebrews. We know this focus here. We know this talking about let us not cease gathering together as some have. And in just a minute, we'll look at another passage that talks a little bit more about what that gathering together is. But the reason why we gather, you've heard me say this before probably multiple times. But again, when people ask people inside of church buildings why you come to church, and you get all these different answers, a lot of the answers that people will give will absolutely break your heart if you know and get and understand Jesus. The answers will just break your heart. And so I continue to reiterate this idea. Our God is not a God of Greek mythology. The Greek mythology, if you've read any of it, or if you've watched any even movies even, you know that their power, they drew their power from belief. How people believed in them, how much or how little gave them how much power they had or not. Our God is our God regardless of us. God does not need us for God's purpose to gather in a building once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, whatever you come, 8 times a week, whatever it is. God doesn't need that for God's sake, but God established this for our sake because God knew we needed this. God knew we needed family. God knew we needed to be together, that we needed to be together in family and fellowship and communion, even if that brought a whole different set of problems. Even if that brought up other issues. And God knew that what that did is that would encourage us, that would build us up. It says God set this in place so that we could spur each other on to do great things. We could spur each other along in love. We know when someone in here comes up with a project or someone who needs help, they're not on their own. They then get to spur along the rest of us to do great things. No one in here could collect 100 smile boxes and coordinate with all these other churches to get their smile boxes and coordinate getting them to somewhere to then get on a shipping container to get to Nicaragua. But one person hearing about something like that can spur on others around in that fellowship to do it. God also knows that much like, Martin Luther says that, marriage is the great school of character. Much can be said of the church in that same way. Church teaches us how to love. Church teaches us how to confess. Church teaches us how to forgive, how to reconcile, how to work with, how to move on, how to forgive, how to love, how to imitate Jesus with those who are of similar mind, if not like mind. And it also says, guys, if we can't do it with those who are of similar mind, how can we ever expect to do it out in the world with people of opposite mind? How can we claim to love a God who we have not seen if we claim to hate a brother or a sister who we can see and we share a seat with? Go back to 1 John. Back to 1 John. We're going to look at chapter 2. What you will not ever hear me say is that if you miss church, if you don't come to church, then God's level of love for you drops down. You will not ever hear me say if you miss a church function, this isn't about earning hell or heaven points, right? And those are some of the answers that people give that break your heart. We're not on a tally system. Thank God. We're not on a tally system. Jesus removed any tally system. This isn't about getting good check marks and bad check marks and we hope it works out. If you want that, go become a Muslim. They've got that. It's a check mark system. We don't. We don't. So this isn't, there's no equation. There's no, you get to heaven and God looks at your church attendance, right? You get to heaven and God says, why should I let you in? And we go, you shouldn't. No reason whatsoever, but Jesus, but Jesus. That's our only answer. There's no church attendance, there's no number of mission trips, there's no, I had that one kid in Sunday school class, except for Mac, I get bonus points for Mac. There's none of that. Okay, so don't mishear me or misunderstand me or misquote me, all right? But what it is gravely important for us. Gravely important for us as believers to have this. And if you look in 1 John chapter 2, verse 19, John is talking, John is writing here. 1 John is an absolutely amazing book. Amazing letter. 1 John 2:19 though says this, it's talking, it says, they went out from us, but they were not of us, because if they had been of us, they would have continued with us. They went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would have continued with us. But they went out that it might become plain that they all are not of us. And he goes on to say, look, I'm talking to you because you know better. He goes on to say, I'm telling you this because you know the answer. You know Jesus. He said, if you know, then you know how important the fellowship is. Jesus spent his time with 12. Jesus spent his time with 3, There were 3 inside the 12 that he spent the majority of his time with. There was the 12 he spent huge amounts of time with. There were the crowds, there were the people, there were the followers, and then he sent his followers out, and he sent them out in pairs and in groups, understanding from the very beginning a cord of 3 strands, right? Fellowship is unbelievably important. Family is unbelievably important for everything that we do. And one of the reasons why this is so important is, again, like I said, this isn't about, something came up and you missed a Sunday. This isn't about you had, a family reunion and you went and you missed a Sunday. That's not what we're talking about. But what we do know is that statistically speaking, if somebody misses a month, if somebody misses 4 Sundays, then statistically speaking, they're going to miss at least 6 months after that before they ever come back into the fold again. We have, because of this habit and because of this self-talk, and guys, we know from the very beginning of time until now, the deceiver, the interrogator, the accuser, Satan, the greatest tool is isolation. If he can get someone isolated, if he can get me isolated, if he can get you isolated, it becomes so much easier. That's why confession, in the Bible when it talks about confession, it's not talking about getting right with God again. It's talking about confessing to one another. It's talking about the relationship with the body of believers. Because God knows that confession removes isolation, and isolation is what kills. Isolation is what kills. Genesis 3, who did the serpent tempt? Eve. Where was Adam? With Eve. Eve wasn't there by herself. Adam just didn't say anything. Eve didn't run get Adam, right? Eve handed Adam the fruit. She didn't go get him. Isolation, solitude, silence kills. It kills you. We see it in everything. We see it. If you've ever had a teenager, you've seen it in teenagers. You've seen it in people with depression. You've seen it in people with drug abuse. You've seen it with people in sin. You've seen it in people when a divorce occurs and there's shame or something involved with this or perceived embarrassment, and they isolate themselves, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And when you don't have the family around you to build you back up, you start to believe those words that are not coming from Jesus. All right. Give me a show of hands. Who in here knows what Babylon Bee is? All right. So Babylon Bee, I would ask a show of hands who knows what the Onion is, but you all would lie and not raise your hand. Babylon Bee is a Christian news company out of Nashville that they run satire. They run satirical news pieces. It's all fake, and it's all hilarious, and it's a Christian group who is mostly poking fun at us as Christians as we get to do, amongst ourselves. Most of it, though, is sarcasm. Sarcasm, by definition, is to cut, right? Most of theirs is very, very satirical. It is very heavy in sarcasm, and it is meant to cut within our own family to show us things. I'm going to read you something from them. I give you all that preface so everyone remember what I just said. This is not a real news article. Say that with me. This is not a real news article. However, I can assure you that it really is. This is one of the things we're talking about and why we're talking about it. All right. From the Babylon Bee. After 12 years of quarterly church attendance, parents shocked by their daughter's lack of faith. This is your headline. Local father, Mr. Michelson, 48, and his wife, Carrie, 45, are reeling after discovering that after 12 years of steadily taking their daughter to church every Sunday, that they didn't have a more pressing sporting commitment, which was at least once every 3 months. She no longer demonstrates the strong quarterly commitment to the faith that they raised her with, now that she is college-aged. Mr. Michelson was simply stunned at the revelation. I just don't understand it. Almost every single time there was a rained-out game or a break between school and club team seasons, we had her in church. It was at least once per quarter. And aside from that one tournament in 11, we never missed an Easter. It was obviously a priority in our family. I just don't get where her spiritual apathy is coming from. I can't tell you how often we prayed on the way to a game. You know, the more I think about it, the more this illustrates how much the church just keeps failing this generation, lamented the mother, citing a recently Googled study by Barna or someone like that. The Michelsons further noted plans to have a chat with the pastors of their church and the youth minister after their younger son Robert's soccer season calms down a bit. We have, we've done the sermons before. We've done the D6 sermons before. We've done the 1/68 before, where, you know, if we go to church 1 hour a week, okay, there's 168 hours in a week, so 1 out of 168 were there. Adult spiritual development cannot be propped up or maintained by a preacher. It cannot. A youth's entire spiritual development cannot be propped up on a Sunday school teacher, a preschool teacher, a children's church teacher, or a youth minister. It cannot. But furthermore, and we see this all the time, we as adults, we'll get a call from someone who we have talked to who is, really needing to decipher that voice of Jesus. We won't see them for 2 months, and then they'll call and they'll say, I don't know what's going on. I've just gotten in such a bad place. Pick me. We see it in kids. We see kids who stop coming to church when they're in 5th grade. And then when they're seniors in high school, parents are like, well, I don't know what's wrong with them, but I do know it's your fault. Guys, we're not that good. We're just not that good. But as a family, we are. As a family, we are. This is why gathering together is so important. It's not to satisfy some checkbox. It's not to make sure our tallies get a higher quota, right? It's not so we can check in on Instagram or Facebook and show everyone that we're at a church building. It is so we can be family in the good and the bad, in the easy and the hard, in the birth and in the death, in the life and in the pain, in the joy and the suffering. It is why we are instructed to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. We've got to be around each other when we're weeping. We've got to be around each other when we're joyful. We've got to be around each other when things are hard or when things are good, when we're in a bad place or in a great place. Because when I'm in a bad place, I guarantee someone in this family is on a mountaintop. And I also guarantee that God will put our two paths on a collision course. When I'm on a mountaintop, I guarantee somebody is walking through a valley, and God will put our paths on a collision course if we are together. It's the fellowship of the believers. It's the family that we are supposed to have. God set it up this way for us out of God's great love and God's great understanding of who God created. Amen? Like God created us, God knows what we need, even when we don't. That's the beauty of church. That's why we have buildings that we can come to. The church isn't the building. We don't go to church. We are the church. But we have to be tied together. We have to be together in family, not in uniformity, but in unity. Just like every other family dynamic we have, and every other family that we have experience with, and every other family we gather over tables We gather around tables, we gather over meals, we gather over bread and drink. This family is no different than that family. But that is why this family is so important. We need this. We need this. There's a preacher, he and his wife lost their son several years back. On a Wednesday, their son died. And that Sunday morning, he was the preacher at the church. Obviously, he didn't preach that Sunday morning, but their son died. Their young son died Wednesday, and Sunday morning, he and his wife were at church. And after church, he said he was most shocked because everyone came up to him after church, person after person, and said, "Thank you so much for being here. It's such an inspiration." He's like, "I didn't come to be an inspiration. I came because you all are what I needed. Where else would I go in a time like this?" That is why we're here, and that's why the church is the church. Because we want to be exactly what someone else needs, and we want to have, in times of mountaintops and valleys, this is where I come because where else would I go? You are the people of my family that I need. This morning, as Mark leads us in a song, that's what we want to be. If we can be family to you in some way, then this is just an opportunity for that. Each Sunday, we typically end with, whatever you want to call it, a closing, an invitation, an altar call, whatever you want to call it. We end with something similar to this. There's no command for this. There's not really even a great precedence for this, but this is tradition, and it's a time that we use, and it's not a time or the same way that lots of churches do it or all churches do it. It's just something that we have done, and it serves a lot of purposes. But what I want everyone to understand is it is just a time of family, though. It is a time where if you need to know who Jesus is, who this Jesus that we're talking about is, that may sound very different than a Jesus you have heard about, it's a time that you can come and talk to someone about that. It's a time where if you want to be baptized, like this is a time that you can come forward and we can baptize you into the family of Christ, the family of God, the family of Highland View. If this is a time, we've had a few families here in just the last month who have joined Highland View. This is a time that you can come and say, I want to be a part of this family. It's a time as whether you are a part officially of this family or not, because as I always say, if you walked in the doors, you're a part of the family. We adopted you, we didn't even ask. And so if you're here, it's a time that if you need prayer, we want to pray with you. If you are on a mountaintop, we want to share that with you. If you're in a valley, we want to walk there with you. If you don't know where you are and you don't know what to say and you just need someone to sit silently with you, then that's what we want to do. This is what this time is for. If you need prayer, this isn't about, some ranking system, right? Like, we understand that every single person in here, we all need prayer. And so it's supposed to be a time where you can just let the family in on whatever your prayer is. This doesn't have to be life or death, though it can. It can be, hey, I could really use some prayers because I've got, this big thing coming up this week. Or I could use some prayers because, I considered putting my kids on Craigslist this morning. Or whatever it is, this is just a time where we want to be able to share and commune and fellowship and pray with you. If we can be family in any of these ways, this is just an opportunity to either walk down, talk to me, or Ray or Johnny or Kevin or whoever else is standing down front, or Aaron or Fanny or Joanne or one of the elders who are standing back on the back wall, to grab any of us and just let us pray with you or talk to you or just stand there in silence and be a presence to you this morning as Mark leads us. Thank you.